So welcome everyone. Wonderful to see everybody's faces. Hope everyone had a good Shabbat. We got outside a little bit and excited to learn these sources with you tonight. We're going to go all the way back to the beginning of our holiday cycle. It's very important to experience and understand the Chagim not as independent days of celebration, one disconnected from the next, but rather as a symphony, a whole unit, starting all the way back with the 3 weeks and going all the way through Simchat Torah. And all the Chagim, all those holidays, Tisha B'Av, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, all working together in concert like a giant symphony, each different, each very unique, but also playing on similar themes, developing themes, and moving us through an entire spiritual season and experience. And that's the frame I want to use tonight to think a little bit about Yom Kippur and our avoda on Yom Kippur. It's very much inspired by the work of Rabbi Alan Liu, who wrote a wonderful book which everybody should read, every Jew should read, called This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared. Fantastic work that uses this frame to think about the holidays. And so we're going to go back. We're going to go back to the beginning of our cycle, all the way back to the 16th of Tammuz. So in the summer, we have our 3-week period of mourning, and that really begins this whole season of reflection and growth through the high holidays. And on the 16th of Tammuz, something very terrible happened. On the 16th of Tammuz, the Jewish people were in the desert, and they saw that Moshe was taking a long time to come down from Mount Sinai, and they got worried. They got worried that Moshe had abandoned them. This whole thing, the tablets, God, revelation, Judaism, it was all for naught. And they said, come, make us a God who shall go before us. For that man Moses who brought us from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. And of course, from that desire comes a very terrible thing. Rashi tells us that on that day was the 16th of Tammuz, that Satan came and threw the world into confusion. It was a day where the world was confused, and Satan made the day dark and gloomy and disordered. If you were outside today, the world was a little dark and gloomy. I don't know if you saw the sky. Feels like things are a little disordered. Things are a little crazy. And people were confused, and they said, surely Moses is dead, and that's why confusion came into the world. The 16th of Tammuz is a day of confusion, disorder, chaos. And the people say, on that day, let's make a new God. And so they do. And then the next day, Moses comes down. He sees the camp and the calf, the golden calf. He sees the dancing. He becomes angry. He takes the 10 commandments, vayishaber otam, and he breaks them. Shever, shvira. There's a great breaking. And Rashi tells us again, Sharei b'shiva asar b'Tammuz nishtabru haluchot. On the 17th of Tammuz is the day that the 10 commandments were broken. And that's where we begin. We began the 17th of Tammuz with breaking. The tablets are broken. And then, of course, from the tablets, we have many things that are broken in Jewish history on the 17th of Tammuz. The walls of Jerusalem are broken on the 17th of Tammuz. It's a day, the beginning of great, great breaking, culminating in the ultimate breaking of Tisha B'Av. The 3 weeks leading up to the 9th of Av, where the temple is broken, where our relationship with God seems to be broken. It's a tremendous breaking. That all begins with a physical breaking. This theme of breaking runs through the rest of the high holidays. There's a lot of brokenness. On Rosh Hashanah, we sound the shvarim, again from that root, shever, which means to break. That's one of the shofar sounds. The sound of lamentation, of wailing, of a broken spirit. We talk about in our liturgy how we are kecheres hanishbar. We're like a pottery shard that's broken. And so much of our supplications and our yearnings and our cryings out reflect our brokenness, our broken deeds, our broken relationships, things that we wish were different. We are broken. That's a theme that runs all the way from Tisha B'Av through Shiva Tammuz, through Tisha B'Av, through Rosh Hashanah, through Yom Kippur. And that's what I want to focus on tonight, this theme of brokenness. There's a quote from a therapist named Estelle Frankel who writes about brokenness in our lives. What does it mean when we say something's broken in our lives? She writes, it's times when our lives, as we have known them, are shattered by the intrusion of fate or disappointment. Our lives feel broken when our lives, as we have known them, are shattered by the intrusion of fate or disappointment. I think looking back on the past year, we can all point to specific moments when it felt like there was brokenness happening all around us and in our personal lives. I keep going back to this conversation I had with Hody over the summer about school in the coming year. We talked about, well, there might be Zoom school or there might be mask school. And we were just discussing Zoom school and mask school. And all of a sudden I just stepped back. I said, this is so messed up. This is so broken. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to be Zoom school or mask school. You're supposed to have school. And that's just one tiny example, I think, where we can all think of things as we expected them to be, as they used to be in the broader societal level, being very shattered by the intrusion of fate and disappointment. Things that we'd hoped for this year that we can't do. The holidays, the singing, the experience of communal power singing, it's broken. It's not the way we want it to be. And I'm sure for many of us in our personal lives, Kal v'chomer, those of us who have experienced real loss and real illness, a deeper brokenness. And it's also a time when I think maybe some of us feel like the world around us feels broken. Things aren't working the way they're supposed to be. Our nation isn't working the way it's supposed to be. The world around us, people aren't engaging with each other the way they're supposed to be. There's so much that feels very, very broken. So we're going to dive into brokenness tonight, into shvira, into shever. Because I think while it can be so painful, there's also some very interesting things in Jewish thought that emerge from brokenness. So let's go back to our sources. Waves. On Yom Kippur, we read about shvira, we read about shever, shin bet resh, breaking, but in a different way. We read about it in the book of Jonah. The famous scene, Jonah's in the belly of the fish. Vayitpalel Yonah el Hashem Elohav mimei hadaga. Vayomer karati mitzara, I called out in my trouble. And Hashem answered me from the belly of Sheol. I cried out and you heard my voice. V'tashlicheni metzula b'levav yamim v'nahar yisovaveni kol mishbarecha v'galecha alai avru. You cast me into the depths, into the heart of the sea. The floods engulfed me, all your waves, mishbarecha, shever, swept over me. This is an image of Jonah drowning. It's a very scary image in many ways. He's drowning in the sea. The waves are crashing over him, wave after wave after wave. Shever, mishbarecha are crashing over him. The deep engulfed me and weeds twined around my head. Now this is an interesting image, or an interesting, not image, it's an interesting connection. Shever, which means broken, also means waves. Perhaps some of us can relate to this also over the past year. It seemed like at times there were just waves of oftentimes bad news seemed to be crashing over us. First, we had the shutdown, and there were the waves of that and the waves of the repercussions. This is closed, now this is closed. You can't do this, you can't do that. It felt like waves crashing over us, and we may have felt like we were drowning. Then I remember George Floyd, a whole different wave. All of a sudden, there were these horrible images of a man being murdered. And then the horrible images of cities burning, wave after wave after wave crashing over. It felt like we were drowning. Waters closed in over me, the deep engulfed me, weeds twining around our head. But waves aren't necessarily, they can be dangerous. They are dangerous often, and they're powerful. But waves can also take you somewhere. Waves can be surfed. Waves can be ridden. And look at this Gemara from Yevamot. I love this Gemara. And I want to give credit to one of my teachers, Malila Helner Eshed, who pointed this out to my Hartman group over the summer, some of these connections. Amar Rabban Gamliel, Pam achat ha'itim alech b'sfina, harati sfina achat shenish berat. Rabban Gamliel says, once I was traveling on a boat, and I saw a boat that was broken. Shever, there's that word again. I'm going to keep finding that word tonight. The boat was broken. V'hayiti mitztar al tamid chacham Shabbat, and I was sad because there was a Torah scholar who was on board. Uminu, Rabbi Akiva. It was Rabbi Akiva, right? So Rabban Gamliel goes out and he sees a broken vessel. He sees a ship that's smashed and shattered, and he's very sad because his friend, the great sage Rabbi Akiva, was on that boat. Ukshaliti b'yabasha, ba'vi yashav v'dan lefana. Ukshaliti b'yeshiva, ba'vi yeshiv v'dan lefana b'halacha. And then I went to, b'yabasha, I went to dry land. And I saw him, and he came up, and he said, halacha before me. He survived. Rabbi Akiva survived the shipwreck. Amartilo, b'ni, ma'alecha. What brought you up? How did you survive? Amarli, daf shel sfina nizdameli. V'chol gal v'gal sheba alai na'aniti li roshi. He said, a plank from the boat came my way, and I grabbed on, and every wave that came, I ducked my head, and I held onto my plank, and I ducked my head. And that's how I survived. And I washed up on shore. So Rabbi Akiva, in this story, his boat is shever, it's broken, there's destruction. But he grabs hold of something, and he's able to duck the waves, and is able to make it to dry land, and to teach halacha, to teach Torah. He survives. The story continues. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Akiva. Now Rabbi Akiva is telling the story. Pam achat ha'itim alech b'sfina, v'ra'iti sfina achat shemetarefet b'yam. One day I saw a boat that was completely destroyed in the water. V'ha'iti mitztar al tamid chacham sheba. And I was sad because someone, a great scholar, was on that boat, and I was sad that he died. And who was it? It was Rabbi Meir. And then he says, here in the English, but when I disembarked at the province of Cappadocia, he came and sat and deliberated before me about halakha. Rabbi Meir survived. And Rabbi Akiva is stunned. How did you survive the shipwreck? How did you survive your boat being torn apart by the waves? I said to him, my son, who brought you up from the water? He said to me, one wave carried me to another, and that other wave to another, until I reached the shore, and a wave cast me on dry land. I love this little episode. It's the story of two rabbis dealing with brokenness, dealing with shipwreck, with disaster, dealing with waves crashing over them, and making it to dry land, and making it to shore, and teaching their Torah afterwards. Survival. And I love that there's two different models. We have the model of Rabban Gamliel, who grabs a daf shel sfina. When I think about that daf, can't help think about daf of Gemara, the Torah, right? He's grabbing onto the page, and that keeps him afloat. And with that, he's able to duck under each wave as it comes. And that's one model for survival, for surviving the waves. To hold on to something fast that roots you, hold on, and then as the waves come, slip under, duck the waves. But the other model is also powerful. The other model is more of a release. It says, you know what? The waves are coming. I'm just going to let the waves take me where they take me. The waves are going somewhere. They're powerful, they're scary, but they're actually going somewhere. And I'm just going to ride the waves. And I'm going to trust that the waves are going to bring me to shore. And that's the model of Rabbi Meir. That could be a way of thinking about waves, even waves of brokenness, which have been in our past and which may come again, which likely will come again into our lives in some form or another. There is always going to be another wave. One strategy Hold on tight to something which grounds you, which keeps you afloat. Don't let go. And when the waves come, just try to avoid them. And the other way is to surrender to the waves, to have trust in the waves and see where they'll bring us. I want to look at another concept deeply connected to brokenness. The same word, shever, brokenness, but now in a very different context. That is the context of birth. This is from the book of Isaiah. Yomru elav, amar Chizkiyahu, yom tzara v'tochecha u'nitzah, hayom hazeh, kivau vanim ad mashber, v'koach ein laleda. Chizkiyahu says this is a sad verse from Isaiah. It's a day of distress and rebuke and disgrace. Now he's going to compare it. What is this day like? It's like a day when the children come to the point of birth, mashber, and there's no strength to deliver them. So that's a very scary image, right? The child is about to be born, and there's not enough strength. Ein koach laleda. But the word itself, mashber, is something to do with birth, the breaking point of birth. Rashi says it's not just a metaphor for birth, it's something very literal. Ad mashber, ad tzara hadoma leisha yoshevet al mashber ve'en koach ba liled. Mashber is the birth stool. She's sitting on the birth stool. Mashber shamushat isha hachorat leilad. It's when a woman is getting ready and there's a physical thing called a mashber that she sits on, the birthing stool, and gets ready to bring new life into the world. So mashber means brokenness, mashber means waves, and mashber means a place of birth. A place of birth. And there's a very powerful image from the Zohar which talks about this, and this is very mystical. We may not fully understand exactly what the Zohar is describing here. But basically what we see is, this is a picture of the Heichalot, of supernal realms, the heavenly realms. And in the heavenly realms, there are two supports in the hall. There are pillars. There's this beautiful celestial hall, and there are pillars in the hall. And the pillars, what supports the pillars are the birthing stools of the world, the mashbers. They take the sounds of women in childbirth and set them before this hall. So in this celestial hall, all the sounds of women crying out in birth are brought up to heaven, and they're placed in this celestial hall. And you can think of this as metaphor, you can think of this as, all in a spiritual realm. But the sounds of women giving birth are there. And listen to this, those sounds have power. When the other side comes to accuse, when the demonic forces come to accuse, at that hour, a time of danger, these arise. Right? When negative energies come in to try to cause trouble, the sounds arise and escort those sounds to the one in charge of the opening, and the other side is unable to accuse. Sometimes the other side proceeds, enters, and accuses, and is able to inflict harm. Again, you don't have to understand every layer what the Zohar is saying here, but what the Zohar basically is getting at is that the sounds of women giving birth are almost spiritual antidote and protection from forces that seek to give harm in the word. And it's that same word, the mashber. It's the sounds from the mashber. And if you've ever been in the room, for the men, if you've ever heard your wives giving birth, or the women, of course, know this way better than any man would know it. Those are sounds of great brokenness, sounds of extreme pain and crying out, sounds that if you heard them, you would think something terrible was happening if you didn't know what was actually happening. Once in New York, I had a neighbor, and they didn't tell us. They did a home birth. I thought someone was being murdered inside. I almost called the police because I heard these horrible sounds coming from next door. But it was the sounds of life. It was the sounds of new life being brought into the world. It was the sound of the mashber. It was the sound of shever, shin bet resh. But not to do destruction, but ultimately to bring life and bring goodness. So that's a third way we can understand the mashber, the shever that we're talking about. Shever means brokenness. Shever means waves. And shever means birthing stool. Place of crisis, but place of life and birth and newness. Now, especially think that last one is so powerful. And I don't want to suggest necessarily that, some people say, well, out of every bad thing that happens, something good happens. And that may or may not be true, I don't know. But that's not always a helpful thing to say to someone who's going through a difficult thing. Right? We don't want to say when someone is suffering and in pain, you don't say, well, don't worry, something good will come out of it. That might not be the comfort that the person needs at the moment. And not every bad thing happens has a silver lining. There are some things that happen that are broken, that are just bad. That at least in our lifetime, we'll never see something good that comes out of it. But at the same time, I think that with everything that breaks, there is always something new that comes out of it. With every breaking, there's always a new crack. There's always a new possibility that comes out of it. It doesn't mean that the breaking was good. It doesn't mean that coronavirus is good. It doesn't mean that all the things that may have happened to us, the losses we've experienced, are good. But there's always something new that can possibly emerge. Just look at our shul in the last few weeks. We're going through shul crisis mode. How do we have togetherness? How do we daven? How do we do all these things? It's a pandemic. It's a very hard time for our shul and for all shuls. And yet, if you look over last Rosh Hashanah, something amazingly beautiful happened. Yes, the davening was not as great as it normally is. And yes, someone got stung by a bee outside. I'm so sorry. And yes, there were, challenges, and not everyone, got everything that it wasn't exactly the way we all wanted to have it. And yet at the same time, over the last few weeks, so many people came together to do so much good for so many other people, whether it was delivering stuff to people in their homes or teaching classes online, or all the amazing energy and work that went into running 5 different services, Rosh Hashanah mornings. So many people have come together to make something beautiful, a beautiful high holiday season in a time that is very difficult and very broken. That's something that was born out of the crisis. That wouldn't have happened if we weren't in the situation now. So there's always something which can emerge, always something that can emerge from the brokenness. And that's hopeful. That gives me hope. And that's, I think, ultimately what Yom Kippur leads us to. So we've been on this little journey through brokenness, and we're going to continue, but think about brokenness living with the wholeness. So let's go all the way back to the desert. And we had Moshe Rabbeinu on the 17th of Tammuz kicking off this cycle, this holiday cycle, with the smashing of the tablets. And then something interesting happens. We're going to get new tablets, right? And that's going to be Yom Kippur. But the old tablets, the broken tablets, don't go away. A very famous Gemara. When Hashem told Moshe to make the new tablets, he said, keep the old tablets also, the ones that are all broken. And not only keep them, but put them in the Aron. They should be in the Aron with the new ones. And this is the idea that we have, that Luchot, the Shivrei Luchot, Munachim Be'aron. The new tablets and the broken tablets were resting together in the Holy Ark, in the Ark of the Covenant. So if you were wandering through the desert 2,000 years ago and you opened the Aron, you would see 2 beautiful, holy tablets, and then you see a pile of rocks smashed right next to it. You would see the brokenness right alongside with the holiness. They'd be resting there in the Holy of Holies. And not only were they resting there, but there was actually something positive about their brokenness. There's a beautiful medrash. Moshe started to be sad. Al Shibur HaLuchot. He started to feel really bad. He's like, oh my God, I broke those holy tablets. Those were amazing. They were written by the hand of God, and I smashed them. And Hashem said to him, Amar lo Kadosh Baruch Hu, Al titztar b'luchot harishonot. Don't worry about it. Don't worry. Don't be sad that you broke those first tablets. Shalo hayu ela aserat dibrot levad. They only had the 10 Commandments. V'luchot hashnim ani noten lach sheyeh behem halachot midrash v'agadot. But the new tablets that I'm giving you, they have halacha, they have law, they have midrash, story, interpretations, they have agada, they have legends, they have so much more. So yes, the first ones, there was great brokenness. And They were written by the hand of God, and it came from this period of brokenness, of idol worship, and like a horrible disaster that befell the world. But from the new set, there's newness, new possibilities that never would have happened with the first ones. And that is Yom Kippur. That's what we're getting ready to celebrate. Remember Rosh Yom Kippur, a happy day. This is the first Rashi continuation that we saw at the beginning, going through the dates. 16th of Tammuz was the day of confusion and darkness. 17th was the day of brokenness. And then the 10th of Tishrei, almost 2 months later, Hashem reconciled with the Jewish people. B'simcha, uvelev shalem, with joy, with a whole heart. V'amar lo Moshe, salachti, I have forgiven you. Masar lo luchot achronot, and gives us the new tablets. Vayarad v'tchil tzvotam al malechet hamishkan, and Hashem came down, and Moshe came down and started to command and instruct how to build the Mishkan, the house, the dwelling place for us and for God. That's Yom Kippur. That's what we're going to celebrate. It's the day where we know and are fully aware of all the brokenness in ourselves, in the world around us. It's a day where we focus in some ways on the brokenness in the liturgy, where we clap our hearts and we remember all the things that we've done wrong. We hold on to the brokenness. We don't just ignore it. We bring the brokenness in. But like those luchot in the Aron, we bring the brokenness in with the hope and with the forgiveness and with the future and with God's presence and with simcha and with joy and with ava, with love. We bring it all in together. We remember that God creates the world through brokenness. In Amitz Koach, the great piyut for Musaf, we start the creation of the world at the very beginning. And we read that piyut that starts with the days of creation and goes all the way up to the Kohen Gadol. We should remember what the mystics teach us about the creation of the world. It was created through brokenness. God created these vessels, filled them with light, but they couldn't contain the light, so they shattered. And the world is the result of their shatterings. But there's great holiness and great kedusha and great godliness in the shattered vessels. We find them, we piece them together, and we reunite the holiness, and we bring joy in God's presence into the world. That's our story of how the world came to be, through brokenness. God creates through brokenness. Yom Kippur is not an optimistic day. It's not a day where we walk in and say, everything's going to be fine. Because we recognize that things are not fine within us and in the world around us. It's not a day of just unbridled optimism. But it is a hopeful day. It's a very hopeful day. That's something I've been thinking a lot about over the last few months. The difference between optimism and hope. Optimism says, I've calculated in my brain, I've looked at the odds, everything is going to be good, I can calculate it and see it out. It's an internal way of looking at the world. I'm optimistic, if I'm optimistic about my chances, I've calculated the odds, and I think I'm going to win when I put my money on this number. It's optimism. It's kind of self-oriented. Hope, I think, is ultimately external. You put your hope in something else. You say, I'm broken, things are broken, but I also believe that they can be different. I trust that they can be different. And I believe in things beyond myself to help make them different. Yom Kippur is a day where we recognize all our mistakes, where we say Unatana Tokef, where we recognize hard things are going to happen, probably in the year to come as well. But it's a day of profound hope. Because hope is living with the brokenness and bringing the hope into the brokenness. It's not saying everything's fine. It's saying, yep, I acknowledge all that's wrong here, but I'm going to bring in hope, bring in a future taste of the world, how it could be, Me'ein Holam Haba, into this moment. If our hope for things, if our optimism is that everything will go back to the way it was, that everything will be fine, everything's going to be great just like it was, whether that's with COVID or with a relationship that's been damaged or with a career that's stalled, if we just look back and think, okay, things will be like they were before, that's going to be frustrated. That's not going to be ultimately realized. But I think if we live with the hope of Yom Kippur, that the brokenness and the whole can be together, it's a very different orientation, a very Jewish orientation towards the future. And that's, again, what we culminate with on Yom Kippur, that second set of luchot, the second chance. And I want to end with final source, which I just love. I think I ended it last year, Shabbat Shuva, with this source also. It's from the Mishnah in Yoma. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Ashreichem Yisrael, fortunate are you Jewish people, Lifnei atem mitarin, mi mitaharetchem, Avinu shebashamayim. You are praiseworthy Jewish people. Before whom are you purified, and who purifies you of your transgressions? Your Father who's in heaven. For it is said, V'zarakti aleichem mayim tehorim utehartem. I will sprinkle clean water upon you. Ve'omer mikveh Yisrael. The ritual bath, literally the hope of Israel, is Hashem. Ma mikveh mitaheret et hatmeim, af HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitaheret Yisrael. So on Yom Kippur, we enter into a mikveh. We enter into mikveh, and that mikveh is not a physical mikveh, that mikveh is God. We enter into God's presence, and that mikveh purifies us. But the mikveh is also the word for hope. So we enter the mikveh with all our brokenness, with all our shvirah, and that shvirah is very real, and we're cleansed by the waters, the heavenly waters of hope. And that gives new possibility and new life for all of us. So what I want to offer as a Shuva kavana, as a way to approach Yom Kippur this year, our Shuva work, the work that we can be doing right now, is to hold on to what's broken. In the world where there's so much broken, in ourselves where there may be things that are broken, to not try to pretend like they're not. They are. To hold the brokenness, to know it, to go into it, to be intimate with it, to be familiar with it. But then, to learn how to ride it, how to ride those waves. Just like we saw in Yonah, how the brokenness is a wave and how those rabbis held on to things that kept them afloat. And also, how they learned how to ride the waves, the shever, the mishberayam, trusting that ultimately it would bring them somewhere. And then to go one step further than that, while we're riding the waves, to also look for the light that's emerging from the cracks, to look for the new life from the mashber, from the birthing stool, from the shever that's coming. To trust that even in darkness, new life and new possibility and new hope is always being born in the world around us and deep within ourselves. So to do the work of holding the brokenness, but also learning to live with it, learning to ride it, to surf it, and then learning to see and to anticipate and to celebrate the goodness that might be and ultimately in some ways will be coming out of it in some form for all of us. So that's an avoda I want to offer for Yom Kippur. And God willing, we'll ride the waves together, whether we're on Zoom, singing Kol Nidri together, whether we're in person, whether at home alone, we will be together. And we'll be together for the future, riding these waves, feeling the brokenness, and also experiencing the newness and the new possibilities that are emerging for all of us. I want to end with something that we sing on Friday nights. It's from the Shabbat, Kabbalat Shabbat liturgy, and we haven't been able to sing it like we normally do in a while, and I look forward to when we can sing it again together. And it's from Tehillim, and it talks about the raging waters, Mishberayam, the waves that are raging all around us. And it's a reminder that even as loud and as crazy as those waves can feel, there is something more powerful and more, even louder, even greater, even stronger than the waves which may feel like they're so powerful all around us. And that's the voice of God. And that's the hope, that's the mikveh Yisrael. That's where we ultimately turn on Yom Kippur. Mikolot Maim Rabim Adirim Mishpereyam Adir Bamaram Adonai. Eidotecha nemnu meyod leveitecha navakodesh Adonai leorech yamim. I invite you to join me in the nigun. Dee dai dai dai. Yai dai dai. Yai dai dai. Yai dai dam. Dee dai dai dam. Yai dai dam. Yai dai dai. Yai dai dam. Dee dai dai dai. Yai nai nai, yai nai nai, yai nai nam, didi dai nai nam, yai nai nam, yai nai nai, yai nai nam. Gemara Chatima Tova, everybody. So wonderful to see you. And turn off the recording, and then we'll unmute everybody. We can all greet each other. Stop recording.